Buongiorno.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I was talking to Enzo Cipolletta at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning, seeing a big crowd here and a lot of people downstairs whom I welcome. Thank you very much for being with us. It's really moving. Today and during this festival, we have been speaking about technology and jobs. Indeed, we are really followed by the media and a lot of people. We had meetings with Freeman at the beginning, then many meetings yesterday. Today, we are going to have a wide approach to a very wide subject for a lecture by our speaker. He's a friend of the festival already. He visited us a few years ago, and he's a very competent person. Adair Turner is not only a university professor, he was a lecturer and a professor at the LSEs and others. He also had very important positions in government bodies as well as in private companies and banks. He was in charge of the Federation of British Industrialists, and Enzo Cipolletta did the same for the Italian Confederation. Indeed, they know each other very well. Maybe Enzo will ask a first question after the lecture. Lord Turner, and he also was in a position in Great Britain as a person in charge the central bank. He worked at Merrill Lynch, at McKinsey. He indeed was a manager and an executive. So he will expand about the changes in the present system from many viewpoints. He wrote essays. He wrote recently text Between Debt and Devil by Princeton. He also wrote Economics After the Crisis, which was also translated into Chinese. I have asked him to start the lecture, which will then be followed by your questions, by talking about the activities of the institute, which you are a chair or a president, i.e. the Institute for New Economic Thinking. And this is my question. One of the key issues we've been dealing in the Festival dell'Economia for 13 years is taking snapshots of the changes in the economic thinking. The economic crisis has questioned many of the economic theories. We hope we are at the end of the crisis, hopefully. So I wonder, is there a new orthodoxy, or are economists in agreement with some theory, or whether, conversely, there are so many different viewpoints with no convergence? Maybe that convergence had never been there. We used to have Washington consensus. Others called it single thinking. So I'd like to know, what is the new economic thinking, if any?
Giuseppe, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. To answer your question, the Institute for New Economic Thinking was set up in about 2010 in response to the financial crisis of 2008. And it was set up in the belief that economics had done a very bad job at forewarning us about the possible financial crisis, and that it had developed into a set of propositions which, while intellectually elegant, were not related to the real world. I think it is fair to say that up until 2008, there was a gradually developing dominant economic orthodoxy, which in theoretical terms we can call neoclassical economics. In policy terms, we can call it the Washington Consensus. And the building blocks of that orthodoxy were the rational expectations hypothesis, the belief that people developed points of view about the future in a rational fashion, the belief that from the rational expectations hypothesis you could derive the efficient market hypothesis, that markets operated in an efficient fashion, and from that derived a broad policy consensus that all we had to do to make sure that the world was stable and efficient was to have as free markets as possible, and that would bring us closer to a competitive equilibrium, the theoretical Pareto optimality, which mathematics can prove is possible. And it was that orthodoxy which I think led to, first of all, a set of political mistakes which has allowed the development of inequality and some of the stresses which give rise to populism. But also that orthodoxy very specifically led to a laissez-faire approach to the regulation of financial markets, which led to the crisis of 2008. And the Institute for New Economic Thinking was set up after the crisis to encourage a more wide-ranging and more real-world economics. Now, there had always been people who diverged from the neoclassical consensus. I see from the poster outside that Joe Stiglitz is here. Joe Stiglitz is very closely involved in the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and of course Joe Stiglitz's own Nobel Prize was for a set of propositions which challenged many of the propositions of competitive equilibrium, rational expectations, and efficient markets. So there always had been alternative economic theories, but I think they were marginalized in policy terms. The overall consensus was dominant. Now, so INET was established to provide funding for research in monetary theory, in distributional theory, in market theory, which provided a richer understanding of the way the world works than the neoclassical consensus had. But to get to the answer to your question, are we going to replace the previous neoclassical orthodoxy with a new dominant orthodoxy? I think the answer is no. Because I think, but this is a challenge, because I think when you truly understand the nature of the economy, when you truly understand the way that human beings work and that they are not entirely rational, when you truly understand the way that markets are not entirely efficient, you cannot develop one beautiful, mathematically elegant model to describe what is going on. You have to accept the complexity of uncertainty, that there are some things that we don't know. That indeed was the great insight in John Maynard Keynes's general theory. At the absolute core of the general theory is the idea that the future is uncertain. And once you accept an uncertain future, I don't think there is a single mathematically elegant, mathematically complete answer. And that, I think, is one of the challenges, because I think there is a strong intellectual tendency and a political tendency for people to gravitate towards systems of thought which are complete. Those used to involve systems of thought which were complete in a Marxist sense and appeared to provide the answer to what had happened in history and what was going to happen in history. We then had systems of thought of the Washington Consensus, which were also equally intellectually complete. I don't think we should aim to have a complete unifying theory. Indeed, my own intellectual lodestar, I guess, are two intellectual guides who have guided me through life. One is John Maynard Keynes, and the other is Karl Popper. And I think Karl Popper's theory of the nature of our understanding of the world is that we should not, and it is dangerous to try to construct complete intellectual systems, and that the core of living in, as Karl Popper put it, an open society is to accept the uncertainty, the contention, and the only partial truths that we can tell about social conditions and economic theory.
Well, thank you. Let's go to the lecture. I'm happy that Remo Baudet is with us this morning. He will appreciate mentioning Karl Popper, surely. And Tito Boeri was here. Era qui Tito Boeri, ma non lo vedo più. Spero non abbia scoraggiato il fatto che...
He's no longer. There were no chairs for him anyway. I'm glad to remind a person who introduced me to him, Arendorf, the first year of the festival, and he is part of the liberal thinking. You have the floor.
Thank you. Great pleasure to be here. Great pleasure to be here with Enzo Cipollata, who we worked together when he was running Confindustria and I was running the Confederation of British Industry. I'm going to talk this morning, hopefully my slides will come up, about capitalism in an age of robots. And what I want to consider is what is the implication of radical automation? What are the implications for society and for economic theory of an environment in which I will assert we will eventually be able to automate all work activities? I have called the lecture Capitalism in an Age of Robots, but just to clarify, by robots I do not necessarily mean a thing that looks like a human being with legs and arms and a sort of smiley face and eyes. By robots I mean any machine, any combination of hardware and software capability that we can use to automate work activity. And my proposition is that we are heading to a world in which we will eventually not have to work, that we do have the capabilities to automate all activity, and that has profound implications and paradoxical implications for the future economy. And just so that I get you thinking up front about what those paradoxical implications are, and so that you can see where we are heading in this lecture, let me highlight 6 things which are perhaps different from the conventional wisdom. First, I am going to assert that the faster the pace of underlying technological advance, the lower the measured productivity growth rate is almost bound to be. Secondly, I will assert that automation threatens income from activities which are essential to human welfare, but does not threaten income which is gained from zero-sum competition. And I will explain what I mean by that. Third, I will assert that the more rapidly information and communication technology progresses, the more that wealth and income will derive from inherently physical and subjective assets, such as land in particular places, or brands, or physical beauty. I call that the high-tech, high-touch paradox. I will argue, therefore, that increasing measured productivity growth is no longer the key priority in developed economies. I will argue that better skills cannot solve the problem of rising inequality. And I will argue that ageing and low fertility are no problem, and that youthful and growing populations are no blessing. So I hope you can see that I am going to use my theoretical constructs to try to provoke many aspects and to challenge many aspects of the conventional wisdom. My lecture is set out in 6 sections, and I think it may be that the last 2 sections I will have to cut for the purposes of this morning, just in terms of the time that we have available, but the text is available, and I have to give you an incentive to read the text, and I can do that by cutting off after the first 4 sections. I'm going to argue that we are heading to a world in which we can automate almost everything, that the question is when, not if. Second, I'm going to address what is called the solo paradox, which is, well, okay, if we keep talking about this automation capability, why is the rate of productivity growth so slow in developed economies? I'm then going to talk about what rapid productivity growth and automation means for the nature of our economy, and argue that things like GDP are becoming meaningless. Then I will talk about challenges for advanced economies, and above all I will say that the biggest challenge is rising inequality. If we have time, I'll say something about emerging economies and about implications for economic theory. Let me begin. My assertion is that we will eventually be able to automate away almost everything, and that information and communications technology is having a truly profound impact on the shape of our economy. Now, whenever one says that, somebody says, yes, but we've had waves of technological change before. We had the agricultural revolution, we had industrial revolution, we had the introduction of electricity. What is different in information and communications technology? But I think there is a reasonable case, and I think it has been very well set out in a book by Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee called The Second Machine Age. I think there is a reasonable case that there's something about information and communications technology which is different. It's different in about 4 or 5 respects. First, the pace of progress in the fundamental hardware is faster than we have ever seen before. Moore's law tells us that the amount of processing power which we can have available from computer chips, or memory, or communications bandwidths, doubles every 18 months. And if something doubles over 18 months, after about 50 years, it goes up by about 3 billion times, because that is the extraordinary power of compounding. So what we have in our mobile phones is thousands of times more computing power than NASA used to put a man on the moon in 1969. And in 50 years' time, we will have 1 million times more capacity again in our mobile phones. This is an extraordinary pace, and it is far more rapid than occurred in the progress of the electromechanical technologies. Secondly, information and communications technology has the extraordinary feature of software, which is that when you've made one copy of a piece of software, the next 1,000 copies, or next 1,000,000 copies, or next 100 million copies really cost you nothing. There is a zero cost of replication. And that is different, and I'll show you why it's different, from the electromechanical era. Thirdly, I think we are on a path in which the development of artificial intelligence is going to equal human capability, partly because of the first 2 effects, and, as writers have suggested, once we achieve general artificial intelligence, we will then create machines which have superintelligence, intelligence far beyond human capacity. And fourthly, we have the extraordinary aspect of machine learning. You do not need, when you are trying to work out how to automate a textile function, to observe how people's fingers work and then write the code for that. What you do is you move a glove on the end of someone's hand, and the machine writes the code as the glove moves. That is machine learning, and it means that we have an extraordinary ability to automate away almost all activities. Now, that establishes the proposition, I believe, that we will eventually be able to automate everything, or just about, which we currently call work. Now, of course, it will occur at a different pace for different types of activities. And there is a very good piece of work which has been done by McKinsey Global Institute, and it was produced last year, where they tried to think through which types of work would be automated earlier and which would be automated later. To do that process, they began by thinking about fundamental human capabilities like sensory perception or fine motor skills or gross motor skills. And they said, can a machine do those as well as a human being now? If you look down at the bottom, it is green shaded against gross motor skills. Gross motor skills means the ability of, for instance, an automated pickup truck to pick up a pallet and put it exactly where you want that pallet. Machines can do that better than human beings now. Fine motor skills are things like sewing. At the moment, we are a bit short of the ability to automate that, but we will get there. Once you have understood where we are and where we are likely to go in terms of fundamental capabilities, you can translate that into what is the automatability? How much can we automate different categories of activity? And McKinsey argued that 81% of all activities which are predictable, repetitive physical activities could, even with today's technology, be automated. Activities which in total account for 18% of all hours worked in the USA. At the other end, there are a certain set of management functions where only a small percentage can presently be automated. But you can see the different degree of automatability. That then turns into how easy it is to automate functions, occupations, sewing machine operators and graders of agricultural products, or even pickers of agricultural products. Those will be automated. Psychiatrists and legislators, you may rather regret the latter, but psychiatrists and legislators will be a little bit more difficult to automate. Perhaps you do not think that your politicians perform absolutely vital functions or perform them well, but whether or not they are vital functions performed well, they are functions which are quite difficult to automate. And that then takes us through to sectors where things like accommodation and food services are more automatable than, for instance, the professions or education services. But lying behind this is the proposition that it's all a matter of time in which we move on from automating the easy functions to automate to a wider set of functions. And McKinsey have set out two different scenarios of timescale. The one in blue, with an upper and a lower bound, is how long will it take us to be able, technically, to automate away existing work activities. And they say at the moment we could technically automate away 50% of work activities, and that will rise to 100% in an early scenario. Much of that will occur by 2030, in a late scenario by 2050, but it will occur. The second green area is when will it occur, given that the process is determined not just by technological capability, but by the slow process of diffusion in the economy, and because of the economic trade-offs that businesses make between capital and labour. If labour is very cheap, you sometimes don't automate something even if it is technologically possible to automate. And again, they have a range there, but their range essentially says that by the end of this century, it is highly likely that we will automate away almost everything. And what I'm going to do for the rest of the lecture is not focus on if it will occur or even when it will occur, but to assert that the question is when, not if, that we are heading towards the ability to automate everything, and to ask the question when, even if it's in 30 years, 50 years, 100, when we get to an economy in which we can automate away all work, what are the consequences for society? Because what I'm going to suggest is that even if we are only slowly heading towards that endpoint, the fact that we are heading towards that endpoint already has pervasive and observable effects on our economy. However, before asking what are the effects, I first of all have to address the solo paradox. Because economists will say at this point, Adair, you are telling a story of amazing technological advance with all these machines that can automate away everything, but I observe that productivity growth in the US, in the UK, in Italy has actually slowed down. So this chart is taken from Robert Gordon's book on the rise and fall of American growth, in which he points out that the most rapid period of growth in output per person or in output per hour was between 1920 and 1970, which is before we all began to talk about the ability to automate everything through computers. And it was in 1987 that the Robert Solow, Nobel Prize winner in economics, made the famous phrase, "You can see computers everywhere except in the productivity statistics." He said, everybody's talking about computers, but why don't I see them in the productivity statistics? But what I'm going to argue is that the Solow paradox is no paradox. That once you allow for three effects, the Solow paradox is exactly what we should expect to see. Those three effects are what I call first the Baumol effect, in honour of an economist, William Baumol, and an article from 1967 on the economics of unbalanced growth, and the high-tech paradox. Second, what I call the zero-sum paradox, and third, the existence of nil or low-cost benefits which are not in GDP. First, then, the Baumol paradox, the high-tech, high-touch paradox. I think when most of us think about productivity growth, we all probably start with a standard paradigm in our brains, which is about the transition from agriculture to manufacturing. You start 300 years ago, before the Industrial Revolution, with 100 self-sufficient farmers producing 100 units of food. And then we have an agricultural revolution, and we work out how to produce those 100 units of food with just 50 farmers, and the other 50 workers go off to factories in the Industrial Revolution, and they start producing cars and washing machines and televisions, and measured productivity doubles. And in this standard model which we have in our mind, this process is endlessly repeatable. Because in the next period, the 50 factory workers can also produce 100 manufactured goods. The 25 farmers can produce 100 units of food. 50 factory workers can produce 200 cars, washing machines and televisions. 15 of those factory workers go off to produce 60 units of computers, mobile phones and software, and 10 produce healthcare and other services. And every time we take labour out of one sector, we move it into another sector which can also be automated. So that in every time period in this simple model, productivity doubles. It's an endlessly repeatable process, and it's a process which we can apply as much to services as to manufacturing. However, it is important to realise that a different effect is possible. It is possible that when we move from 100 farmers producing 100 units of food to 50 farmers producing 100 units of food, that instead of those people moving to manufacturing, they all become domestic servants, paid half as much and producing just 50 units of value. In which case, agricultural productivity has doubled, but the total economy productivity has only increased by 50%. And if that occurs, if what people move into is in itself not automatable, what we have over time is an asymptotic process where in each period agricultural productivity improves, people go off to be domestic servants, more and more people go off to be domestic servants, and eventually there is a mathematically asymptotic limit where productivity has gone up by 100%, but that is as much as you get. And whereas I have shown it there, with them moving into low-paid jobs, it can also be moving into high-paid jobs. We can have the 50 farmers producing 100 units of food, 45 domestic servants paid half as much to produce 45 units of value, and 5 artists, singers, entertainers, and fashion designers paid twice as much. Again, the productivity growth will eventually come to zero. Now, this is theoretically possible, but I also think it's important to realize that I think it has happened before. I think this is essentially what happened about 8,000 years ago in the first agricultural revolution, which began in the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, northern Iraq and Syria as it is today, about 8 millennia ago. We worked out how to get much more productive in terms of agriculture, but there was no permanent revolution in productivity across the economy because all of the surplus went into huge numbers of domestic servants for the priests and the kings, the building of pyramids, the creation of artistic activities, but there was no perpetual revolution. And indeed, many historians of that period believe that the standard of living of ordinary people actually declined despite the agricultural productivity revolution and was lower than for hunter-gatherers. So it is possible and it has occurred. Now, we tend to believe it will not occur in future because we tend to think, and perhaps we are right to think, that we live in a world in which we will always create new productivity capabilities. We will always work out how to automate new activities, whereas in the 6th and 7th century, they'd worked out how to increase agricultural productivity, but they then didn't have a manufacturing revolution. Whereas today, we have organized processes of scientific discovery and innovation and entrepreneurship where we continually create new productivity. But the determinant of whether we have this Baumol model or the standard model does not just depend upon whether we physically know how to automate new activities. It also depends upon two other things. First, on the impact of the initial productivity spurt on the distribution of income. And secondly, on what the people who receive income choose to spend money on. If the initial productivity revolution congregates income into the hands of a small number of people, and if those people choose not to buy endless more cars and washing machines, but endless more domestic servants, then you will get a slowdown in productivity growth, even if we physically know how to automate new activities. Now, this is theoretically possible, but is it occurring? Well, in the UK, we have very rapid new labour, job creation. We have low unemployment and new job creation, but we have very low real wage growth. Why is that? That is because we are proliferating in London what I call 21st century jobs. This is a man on that piece of 21st century technology known as the bicycle, with a pizza on his back, or anything else you want, delivering it direct to your house. And we are getting a proliferation of those types of jobs. And if you look at the US Bureau of Labor Statistics figures, you will see that the jobs which are being created in large numbers are not software developers or software applications. They don't even meet the top 10 forecast job categories. There are a whole load of jobs in things like personal care aides, home health aides, nursing assistants, and they are jobs which on average are paid much less than the average income. And we also see this effect in India. I noticed the other day in The Economist magazine an article about the automation of tea packing. A manager was explaining to the Economist journalist that he'd got a new machine to do the packing of tea, to replace a physically repetitive process. And he said, look, round the factory, that job's going, that job's going, that job's going. But the manager insists that, as in the past, he will somehow find jobs for everyone as drivers or as watchmen or as people to bring the tea to management, etc. In advanced economies with rapid productivity growth in some sectors of the economy, you can have that offset by a proliferation of low productivity, low wage jobs elsewhere. The second effect at work is what I call the zero-sum paradox. And let's return to the standard model to understand that, because back in the standard model we have another variant. Suppose we begin with 100 farmers producing 100 units of food. They become more productive, and now we have 50 farmers producing 100 units of food, but the other 50 don't move off to be manufacturers, and they don't move off to be domestic servants. 25 go off and be criminals, and 25 are employed as police to defend the farmers against the criminals. Now, because somewhat arbitrarily within GDP accounting we count police as part of GDP and criminals as not part of GDP, productivity will go up in this case by 25% because GDP will increase. But I think we can all agree that there has been no increase in human welfare. And we can get, in economies, a proliferation of zero-sum activities. There are two questions to ask about those zero-sum activities. One, does total measured productivity rise? In this case, yes, but not as by much as if everybody had gone off to be manufacturing workers. And does human welfare rise? Well, if the activities are zero-sum, no. Now, it's theoretically possible, but is this happening in modern economies? I think it is. I think if you look round the modern economy and look at what jobs people do, you will see an extraordinary proliferation of jobs which essentially cancel each other out. They are zero-sum. They're necessary jobs. Once one person does one side, there has to be somebody on the other side. They're perfectly good jobs. I've done those sort of jobs. I suspect many of you do those sort of jobs, but they cannot possibly increase human welfare. Anybody who works for a major company now knows that we are very, very worried about cyber criminals. Lots of very, very clever people are making income as cyber criminals. And we are now within companies employing more and more lots of very, very clever people to defend us against those cyber criminals. But that is a zero-sum activity. Suppose we get cleverer and cleverer people going to become divorce lawyers. Will human welfare increase? Well, no. The income of divorce lawyers might increase, but there will be a very clever divorce lawyer on this side and a very clever divorce lawyer on that side, and it's zero-sum, it cancels it out. That is true for a lot of corporate lawyers. That is true for the political process, which employs more and more people, and in America now accounts for absolutely enormous uses of money and technology devoted to a political fight which must be zero-sum. That is true of a lot of advertising, trying to persuade you to buy brand A, not brand B. It is even true of some aspects of education, where education is partly an increase in human capital, but partly it's something you have to do to signal to the job market that you were clever enough to get into that university. And in America, this is unleashing an arms race of expenditure on education, which is essentially a form of zero-sum competition. In the lecture text, I go through in greater detail what all of these zero-sum activities are, but my argument is that we can expect them to grow in a modern economy. Their impact on measured GDP is arbitrary. Divorce lawyers, because they are paid for individually, are in GDP. Corporate lawyers count as an intermediate product, which are not in GDP, but that is sometimes rather arbitrary. They are often highly paid, and they are somewhat less susceptible to automation than the jobs which are really essential. Legislators are less automatable than textile workers. Actually, over time, we will be able to use more technology to improve the effectiveness of lawyers, but it will almost certainly not mean that we employ less senior lawyers. It simply means that in a divorce case or in a corporate case, one will use automation to search for every single ever relevant precedent. One will simply be in an arms race of technological capability on either side. One will improve the quality of the product paid for by client A and client B, but one will not automate it away. So we end up, I think, with what I call the zero-sum paradox, that in the end, automation of textile workers' jobs, which is absolutely essential for the clothes that you have, will mean there are no textile worker jobs at all, whereas the application of IT to legal services will simply mean an arms race of greater capability and skill and a greater computer power employed on either side. Ask yourself this. It is almost certain that by 2050 it will be possible for a team of robots to beat Manchester United at football. But I don't think that will reduce in any way the pay of Manchester United football players. There is something about technology which threatens the jobs and the income of the people who are truly necessary for everything that we need, but does not threaten the jobs of people who are involved in zero-sum competition or games. Rapid technological progress could eventually automate away almost all activities which are truly essential for human welfare, while supporting increasingly intensive zero-sum competition for relative income and status, so that zero-sum activities account for an increasing percentage of employment and measured output over time. So, that sounds all a little bit pessimistic. We have this amazing ability to automate things, and what we do is we proliferate a whole load of zero-sum activities, zero-sum competition, or a set of low-paid, low-productivity jobs. The third factor which I'm going to consider might seem a little bit more optimistic, and it is the argument that there are a whole load of benefits going on in our economy which we simply don't capture in GDP. Imagine this. Imagine that sometime this century, a very small number of people are able to be clever enough using artificial intelligence to create a wonder drug. A wonder drug that enables everyone to live to 100 with no health problems whatsoever. No dementia, no arthritis, no early tragic deaths from heart attacks or childhood cancer. We all have 100 years of absolutely certain healthy life. I think we can all agree that that will be an immense improvement in human welfare. But if you run through the GDP accounting and work out by 2100, by which time that drug will be off patent and will be manufactured in an automated factory for almost nothing, what that wonder drug will contribute to GDP, the answer is almost nothing. One of the most important breakthroughs will hardly be in our GDP figures at all. And again, I explore it in more detail in the lecture of how the precise GDP accounting works, but there is a very good argument that what we have is a whole set of things like new drugs, mobile phones and tablets, streamed films and music, computer games and social networks, which are provided at a declining cost, or in many cases just given to you for free, search engines at zero cost, where we have rapid productivity, falling prices and increasing quality, but they are inadequately captured in measures of real GDP and thus productivity growth. Marty Feldstein has argued the text that you can see there. The result is, he says, that the increase in real incomes is underestimated, and that the common concern about what appears to be the low growth of average household incomes is replaced. These low growth estimates, he says, fail to reflect the innovations in everything from healthcare to internet services to video entertainment, which have made life better during these years. Now, I'll come back later to a caveat of why I don't entirely agree with Marty that all these innovations have made life better. But what I think is clear is that there's quite a lot going on in automation which is delivering remarkable new services which we cannot be confident is being captured in GDP. And in the text of the lecture, I set out the three effects combined. You don't need to look in detail through it, you can look at the lecture, but if you ask yourself reasonable parameters of how many of those Baumol type low productivity jobs are being created, how many, and is that growing? How many jobs in the economy essentially zero sum, and is that growing? And how much are we underestimating the value of our mobile phones, our new drugs? With reasonable parameters, you can end up with the results over on the right-hand side, that you can have sectors of the economy where we are achieving rapid and indeed accelerating growth of automation, but we can have GDP much lower and declining. So my argument is the Solow paradox is actually what we should expect to see. What are then the implications of this for the shape of the economy and the challenges for society? The implications for the shape of the economy are that we increasingly have meaningless standard measures of economic success, and that value is going to migrate to new areas. We live with a standard assumption that we know what we're measuring, that we have technological advance can drive productivity improvement across the economy, which shows up in GDP measures of output per hour and per capita, and that provides a good measure of the increase in human welfare. And those, I think, were reasonable assumptions at an earlier stage of economic development, but they are assumptions which are now collapsing. In the long term, I think they collapse entirely. Imagine an endpoint in 2100 in which we have solar-powered robots guided by artificial intelligence systems do almost all the work needed to deliver welfare-enhancing goods and services. But this work accounts for a very small proportion of measured GDP, while almost all human work activity is devoted either to zero-sum competition, lots of lawyers and financial traders and politicians are arguing or trying to get an advantage vis-à-vis one another, or to the explosion, and this might be rather attractive, of the things we can't automate: artistic, craft, design activities, but non-automatable activities, or low-wage activities of face-to-face service. In those environments, the growth or not of GDP per capita, measured on current conventions, will, I suggest, tell us almost nothing about trends in human welfare. Indeed, we can raise the question of whether in that environment the economy even exists. Economics is meant to be about the allocation of scarce resources in production and in consumption. But if robots do all the work, is there any scarcity? Well, the answer is, I think we still have a world of measured income and wealth, but it will have moved to some very different areas. I think most wealth will derive, and much income will derive, from the ownership of locationally specific property, from intellectual property rents, and indeed a crucial determinant of the distribution of income will be what attitude we have towards intellectual property. We will live in a world in which very small numbers of very clever people can create new technological capabilities, new drugs, new artificial intelligence, and the impact of that on income will be entirely driven by what our intellectual property rules are, and how long our patent protection periods are, how long our copyrights are. We will have enormous subjective brand values and rents. Fashion designers, those individuals who are able to create the fashion which captures somebody's attention, will be paid enormous amounts of money. And there will be very high incomes, a very small number of people, skilled or lucky, in IT, subjective value creation, or zero-sum competition. And my argument is that we can see some of this happening already. This chart is taken from Thomas Piketty's Capitalism in the 21st Century. Now, I'm sure that since you've all turned up on a Saturday morning to listen to a lecture in economics, many of you, perhaps most of you, have heard of Thomas Piketty. I'm sure that some of you have bought Thomas Piketty's book, and I'm pretty confident that a rather smaller minority have actually read all 700 pages of Thomas Piketty's book. But it is a very good book, and it sets out this remarkable fact of the amazing variation in the wealth-to-income ratio in modern economies. And here are the figures for France, where the ratio of wealth to income, which was down at about 300%, 3 times in 1920, is now about 6 times. But what Piketty does not himself stress is the blue-shaded bit on this graph, which is that all of that increase in the wealth-to-income ratio is explained by an increase in the value of property, and not by the construction of that property, but by the value of the land on which it sits. Increasingly, wealth in our high-tech economies, paradoxically, is migrating to the most physical thing of all, land, and to an asset which is not produced at all. You can see this in UK national income accounts over the last 20 years. The produced assets, which economists tend to think about, where the capital in year 1 is the capital in year 0 plus the investment in the intermediate year, those produced assets have gone from 2.4 trillion to 4.8 trillion, but the unproduced assets, which is essentially just land, have gone from 1.6 trillion to 5 trillion. We end up, I believe, with what I call the high-tech, high-touch paradox, that the more rapid the progress of information and communications technology, the more value will be placed on inherently physical assets and attributes, desirable land, sporting capability, physical beauty of a supermodel or a film star, and created subjective values, fashion, design, brand, celebrity. What then is the challenge for advanced economies? And I will end with a few comments on this so we have a few moments for questions. Some people think that the challenge is that there isn't going to be enough work to go round. I believe that is wrong. I believe that if you have a flexible labour market, if people have to work to get income, we will somehow create jobs. We will proliferate new activities. We will find things to do. Those may be zero-sum competitive activities, or they may be this proliferation of what I call Baumol-type jobs, low pay, low productivity service jobs, but somehow we'll find things to do. But it is highly likely, I think, that this will be an environment of rising inequality. We have had very significant rising inequality in developed markets for the last 30 years. That has been most dramatic in the US, and whereas I think some of that derives from the globalization of trade and some perhaps from immigration, I think probably the biggest single factor at work is technology. What technology enables is very small numbers of people to create enormous equity value and income. Consider these figures. These are the figures for the equity market value and the number of employees of those amazing internet and IT and software companies, Microsoft, Alphabet, Google, Facebook, Alibaba, Tencent. Facebook, $502 billion of equity market value, 25,000 employees, an absolute drop in the ocean of the global labour market. If you look at that as a relationship between equity market value and the number of employees, it is completely different from the world when General Motors was the most highly valued company in the world. When General Motors back in the 1950s had the highest equity market value in the world, it employed 1 million people. These companies will never employ anything like 1 million people because they simply don't need to. However, we will create jobs. As I showed earlier, the US is creating lots of jobs, but it is creating them in low-paid, low-productivity areas. So, what do we do about this? Well, Marty Feldstein's argument earlier was, don't worry, because actually, although these people have low wages, they've got completely free computer games, and they've got, free drugs that they never had before. But the caveat I have with that is that I don't think you can assume that all those developments have necessarily improved human welfare. I think the wonder drug that I imagined earlier would be a clear increment to human welfare, but I think it is debatable whether the proliferation of ever more sophisticated computer games which lock our teenagers in front of screens all the day long is necessarily an absolute increase in human welfare. And I certainly think that if you imagine a low-paid person facing high property costs, high rents, and high costs of commuting to work, and feeling that they are left behind versus other people getting much higher incomes, telling them it's okay because you've got free computer games is not going to be seen as an adequate answer. Nor do I think that skills is an adequate answer. Now, let me be clear. No one is more passionate about skills than me, about educating people, about enabling people to understand this world in which they live. But however many people know how to code a computer game, all the revenues from computer game writing will accrue to the minute percentage of all competent computer game coders who in that year create the computer games which capture people's imagination. We have in these ICT-intensive industries a huge winner-takes-all tendency. And the fact that we give everybody the skills to be an adequate competitor in that area will not mean that we deal with inequality. So what do we do? An American writer called Tyler Cowen, in a book called Average is Over, has set out a sort of dystopia of how the future will work. He says what we'll do in America is that we've got lots of flat, warm land on which we can put very cheap houses, essentially trailer parks. Poorer people will live in tiny houses in warm climate where there's low land cost. We'll provide them with adequate health care. Well, they're not quite doing that in America at the moment, but suppose they do. And there will be close to zero-cost entertainment. Meanwhile, there will be some very competitive people who want to go to London or Paris or Milan and compete like another and earn huge amounts of money, and they'll be involved in all these zero-sum activities, or they'll be the guys creating the wonder drugs in Silicon Valley. And then there'll be a third category of people, which is talented bohemians who will opt out of the major city rat race, and they'll go to live in cities which have a nice living style and relatively low cost because they've been left over by the past. Berlin is one of the favourites now in Europe, Detroit. And there'll be artists or organic urban farmers or beekeepers, and they'll go around on bicycles, and they'll be very happy. I mean, I think it's a very attractive lifestyle. But that's what he says. And he says, people warn that this era of inequality is going to be such rising inequality that the poor will come up and they'll have a social revolution. He says, no, we really shouldn't expect rising income and wealth inequality to lead to revolutionary revolt. The long-term picture will be fairly calm, but unbelievably unequal. Now, of course, responding to that, you've got to decide two things, whether you believe that that's where we're heading and whether it's acceptable. I don't think it's acceptable, but I do think Tyler Cowen has captured something about how these trends will play out. I think we have to try to make sure it is not as unequal as he is suggesting. What are the policies that might make a difference? I think we will have to consider redistributive taxation on real property wealth, capital gains and inheritance, because I think we live in a world in which real property is just going to rise in value. I think we should consider less favourable treatment of intellectual property royalties and rights. I do not understand at all why the US has found it necessary to extend the property right of the Walt Disney a copyright on Mickey Mouse. We have intellectual property rights in order to encourage creativity and intellectual property creation. Well, we don't need to give Walt Disney any new incentives to create Mickey Mouse, because Mickey Mouse already exists and Walt Disney is dead. So the extension of the copyright for Walt Disney is simply providing a distributional flow of income. It has no beneficial effect. Economists don't often talk about economic geography, but thinking about urban design and development is important because we need to find a way to make as many cities as possible and as many areas of cities as possible pleasant, attractive, desirable places to live, so that we do not intensify this endless competition for the property in New York, in Shenzhen, in Hong Kong, in London, in Paris, in Milan, which drives up property prices. We may need to consider universal basic income to make sure that people have an adequate lifestyle, even if they do not earn high monetary incomes. And I think we have got to simply decide as a society that we provide adequate pay for basic services such as social care for the elderly, which we need to expand, which ideally we should want to do in a face-to-face version rather than a robotized version, but which at least in the UK we pay people very, very little to do. And there are some favourable developments. It would be a good idea if people took some of the benefits of increased productivity and leisure, and we need an increased focus on artistic design and craft skills. And by the way, and I'm not going to go into the details on this, I think in this environment it's actually quite good to have low fertility rates and potentially declining workforces, because I think it reduces the process of endless downward pressure on labour. So that's my thought. Every now and then I think I've had an original thought, and then the trouble is I find that one man got there 80 years ago, and that man is always the same man, and it is John Maynard Keynes. Because what I'm saying is not fundamentally different from what John Maynard Keynes said in an article called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, written in 1930, that once we have solved the problem of creation, of production, once we have solved the problem of production, of how to produce things with very little work, then for the first time since his creation, man, he ought to have said man and women, but, we'll forgive his historical tendency there. For the first time since his creation, since her creation, woman will be faced with her permanent problem, how to use her freedom from pressing economic cares, how to occupy the leisure which science and compound interest will have won her to live wisely, agreeably, and well. That is what I think information technology is delivering us, and I actually think that solving that challenge is an even more difficult challenge than solving the problem of production, which I think we are well on path to do so. You will have to read the text to see what I say about the challenges for emerging economies and the implications for economic theory. Thank you very much.
Bene.
Very well. While Lord Turner was talking, I was wondering whether, amongst future scenario, there was also the one that Mr. Dozy evoked yesterday together with Mr. Cipolletta, claiming that a good representation of this world that may come is given by the first film, Blade Runner, where a super-technological minority governs a vast majority of sub-proletarians. I believe we've got about 10 minutes, so we can accept a few questions. But first I would like to ask Mr. Cipolletta if there's any specific question for Mr. Turner. Well, first of all, it was a pleasure to meet the unconventionality of Adair once again. He's one of those economists that François Perrault said managed to reason diagonally, neither pro nor against the existing assumptions. And I remember that when we were both the leaders of our two sister associations, Adair published an article in the Sole 24 Ore stating that wages had to be increased. I mean, for a director of an association of entrepreneurs, the idea of increasing wages is pretty clashing. However, this is proof of the fact of what a free spirit Adair is. So I totally agree with Adair regarding the solo paradox. A couple of months ago, I gave a lecture in Ancona, and I said more or less the same thing, with the exception of the zero-sum activities theory. What is actually missing in the growth of productivity, and I would like to know Adair's opinion in this respect, is actually growth. I mean, if we had more growth, we could have also jobs with higher productivity. But if there is no growth, as in the past 15 years, machines replace men, and workers have to find any job possible, and they can take on only low productivity jobs, and productivity decreases in general. If we had a stronger economic growth and a stronger demand, there would also be a growth in wages, and productivity would also go up, because we would have higher content jobs because of the demand for consumption good and investments that would be stronger than what we have today. So this is my opinion. So I have a specific question for Adair in relation to his position regarding the new thought, INET, INET. I mean, the rational approach is not satisfactory. I mean, people act following different impulses. Some are not rational, for instance. I mean, if we move towards an automated world where algorithms decide about most of the choices and decisions to be made, I mean, if you buy a book on Kindle, you receive so many offers that have all been structured on your previous choice and based on people like him or her who have made these choices. I just erase all that because I can't accept that an algorithm decides for me what I'm going to buy. However, in the world of finances, algorithms are used to know how to invest your money. So the economic theory at this point, should the economic theory investigate the behavior of people or the algorithms? Won't this become a vicious circle? I mean, if 90% of the economy is based on algorithms, why should I study the behavior of people? I have to study algorithms and the people who've made algorithms. And if I want to change the economy, I just have to change the algorithms rather than adopting economic measures. Is this meaningful? And how will the economic theory be modified, considering that a large part of our activities is no longer driven by our decisions, but rather by a series of algorithms who have been decided by people anyway? And even if they learn, the algorithms learn on the base of algorithms that have been constructed. So in this case, human beings are like God in this type of creation. Well, can you please wait a second before giving the answer? Shall we see if we've got other questions? Maybe you can take note of these two first questions. So, will economy in the future study machines rather than human beings? That's the question, second question. And the first question refers to growth. Please introduce yourself. Marco Lusetti.
No.
I psichiatri non...
I'm a psychiatrist, so you won't be replaced by machines.
Internet that can deliver cognitive behavioral therapy for, say, depression. So even psychiatrists can be substituted by robots. But I think the robots are very slow in learning how to pay taxes. Because I pay taxes, but the automatic program to deliver CBT is not paying any taxes. And I think, as you suggested, if this kind of robot can pay taxes, this money can be invested in human development instead of just giving money to very few people. This is what I think. Thank you.
Grazie.
Gabriele, Bertrand Russell diceva che...
I'm Gabriele. Bertrand Russell used to say that the ethics of work is the ethics for slaves, and we do not want any slaves. This is strongly related to the last part of the presentation. Well, at this point, I believe that the challenge is a cultural one. I mean, there is still a mindset which is anachronistic, trying to pursue these ethics of labor, of work, viewing work as something positive, as a principle. However, I believe that this mindset is still very widespread, both on the left side and on the right side. We have to overcome this kind of mindset. How can we do that, since this has become anachronistic? Well, if there are no other questions, we can leave the floor to Adair. But actually, I have a curiosity. How many of you in this room come from Trento? 7 or 8 people? 10? Well, we have seen throughout the years, and this is pretty impressive, that the festival has grown significantly. People attending the festival come from all over Italy, which is something beautiful. Also, if you consider the fact that most of these lectures are also streamed, they are also published on the website of the festival. So before leaving the floor to Adair, just let me tell you that tomorrow, if you're still here in Trento, since I can imagine that many of you will have to go back home prior to the conclusion of the festival at 5:30 in Teatro Sociale, we will have a meeting at 3 with Mr. Soros, the Hungarian finance tycoon, who's actually the founder of INET, the Institute of New Economic Thinking. So he will come to Trento, he will speak with Cipolletta and other economists about the Europe we need in the future. So if you're interested, tomorrow, 3 o'clock, Teatro Sociale. Adair, you have received many, many questions. Can you answer them in about 10 minutes? Thank you. But please speak slowly. Thank you.
Well, just to say, you were commenting on the remarkable achievement of the Trento Festival of Economics. When I was first invited to this Festival of Economics 8 years ago, I think it was, I realized that the words festival and economics were not often combined. Economics was seen as the dismal science, but you've achieved something quite remarkable here. So 3 questions. Within Enzo's question had lots of complexity to it, but let me focus on one thing. Algorithms in financial trading are a really interesting example of what you're suggesting. People are trying to develop algorithms which look at the patterns of financial trading and then automatically spot opportunities to make money. Other people are saying, I have no idea where the market is going to go, so I'm just going to hold a passive index of the whole market. if every single investor in the market was either a non-human algorithm or a passive index investor, the level of the market would become a sort of random number generator because you wouldn't have any sort of real judgment going on as to what the market ought to be. So there are some real challenges in the area of algorithms about the circularity, and that applies in many different areas. It applies in politics. I think what we have realized in the US and the UK with the role of Cambridge Analytica is the way that the use of algorithms is changing the nature of political debate. People are not being presented by an argument which attempts to convince them. The algorithms are trying to work out in advance which argument they are susceptible to, and then making that argument to that specific group of people. And that is really changing the nature of politics in a quite worrying fashion. So I don't know what the answer to this is, but I think there are certainly some incredibly complex issues raised by this dominance of algorithms. On the growth question, and going back to my comment in 1996, which was slightly taken out of context about paying people more, it was in an environment in the UK where we had several years of very low pay increases. But I do think there is an issue for capitalism about the balance of returns for capital and labour. And there's a very good book by Raghuram Rajan, who was at the IMF and then subsequently the Reserve Bank governor in India. And he wrote a book called Fault Lines about the origins of the financial crisis. And he pointed out that one of the problems was rising inequality, because rising inequality led to rising debt levels. That when you had an environment where more and more income was concentrated in the hands of richer people have a high marginal propensity to save because they've already got all the cars and clothes and washing machines and televisions they need. And that can mean that unless something happens, that accumulation of income in the hands of richer people will mean what Larry Summers has called secular stagnation. There will not be enough demand in the economy unless the income of those richer people is picked up by the financial system and lent to poorer people who are trying to make up with the use of credit for the fact that their real wages are not increasing. So if you have an environment of rising inequality, it can be the case that the system only balances and only produces enough demand to drive growth. It produces that with a rise of debt, which is sustainable for a period of time, but then produces a crisis. And Raghu's argument was that that was one of the key origins of the crisis of 2008. And it is true that way back in the early 1920s, Henry Ford was trying to work out who could possibly afford to buy his Model T Ford at the price he was producing it. And he realized that at the price he was producing it, his workers could not afford to buy it, so he wasn't going to sell many. So he did begin to increase the wages of his workers so that they could afford to buy his Model T Ford, and everybody else would hopefully increase the wages of workers so other people could produce other cars and afford to pay it. There is a problem of the balance of income and consumption and savings, which can be upset by rising inequality. And there are it's interesting when one talks about new economic thinking, one sometimes has to return to old economic thinkers. There is an economist called Kaleski who wrote many years ago, a neo-Marxist, about the balance of returns to labour and capital, and they are not unimportant. On the issue whether cognitive behavioral therapy can be automated, whether it be effective or not, whether robots pay taxes. As you probably know, many people have said we should tax robots. The crucial thing, I think, here is to not have that in one's mind as saying, I'm going to look at something which has arms and legs and a smiley face and say, I've got to significantly, tax that particular robot. But, as I said earlier, when I use the word robots, I mean it to represent any category of machine capability, hardware or software. And if you would put it not as we should tax robots, but are we in a world in which we are getting higher returns to capital, higher returns to intellectual property rights, higher returns to real physical property, and for many people, lower real wages? In that environment, we do need to think carefully about our tax policies, and broadly speaking, it would be good if we could impose some more taxes on real property or intellectual property rights or copyright or things like or capital returns, and less on labour. It is true to say that there are tendencies tending to push it in precisely the opposite and perverse direction, and those derive from the fact that ordinary workers find it more difficult to move to avoid taxes than do capital, intellectual property rights, brand names, etc. Once you've got a highly profitable brand name, you can locate the ownership of that brand name in Luxembourg, and then your Italian subsidiary can pay a brand use payment to Luxembourg or Ireland or the Virgin Isles or wherever is a low tax environment. So we do have a problem that logically we should be thinking about shifting our taxation, at least at the margin, away from labour onto other sources of income. But in a globalised world, those other sources of income find it easier to avoid it than does labour. The ethics of work, the ethics of slavery. Well, I think this is a hugely important issue, which we really need to get to grips with. At one level, I don't think that we've just created a sort of focus on work. I mean, Max Weber argued that this was a peculiarly Protestant thing to do, that the Protestant work ethic coming out of Calvinism, that you had to work to prove that you were one of the elect, that you were going to heaven, and that is part of the story. There are parts of the story in which certain forms of religious belief, ethical belief, and the needs of a capitalist society have created a sort of ethos of work. But I think we also need to put it round the other way. People will not be happy without a sense of purpose and a sense of sociability. One of the reasons why simply giving the unemployed money is not a reasonable answer to unemployment is that work is a social environment. Work is where you meet other people. Work is where you often meet friends. It's often where you meet your partner, become married. And we can't entirely replace that. And work, correctly done, gives people, for many people, work is a sense of creativity. Certainly if we're talking about craft work, artistic work, a sense of pride in work. So I don't think we can simply say, okay, we've got all these machines, fantastic. We'll all just work for 5 hours a week, and we'll have 95% leisure. Because I suspect that human beings that something is coded into us biologically. I mean, we are the product of an evolutionary process where, for all of that evolutionary process, we did need to work to live. And so it's probably coded into us that we want to do something which we feel gives us, meaning and satisfaction. But certainly, and I don't have the answer here, I think we're increasingly going to have to think about this. How do we create an acceptance? I think it would be better to have somewhat higher leisure, but how do we also create a society where people do have a balance of work, some income from work, some income from maybe universal basic income, but crucially, from that work, get a sense of, social purpose and value, rather than it simply being, work as slavery, as Bertrand Russell put it.
Bene, grazie a voi, grazie a...
Thank you very much. Thank you, Adair Turner. Enjoy the festival.